In the high summer of 1941, following a desperate plea for help by Mussolini, the disastrous Italian war effort is rescued as German forces move south, shoring up their fascist ally and securing the southern flank of the Axis. In effecting the rescue of the Italians, the forces of Nazism marched to ever greater victories, bringing ever larger territories under their dominion. In just weeks, the lightning successes of the Blitzkrieg of 1940 are matched as German forces sweep southwards, bringing an avalanche of war to the Balkans. Yugoslavia and Greece collapse within days. In Yugoslavia, the German attack reopens ancient enmities and wounds. Yugoslav starts to attack Yugoslav. The Greek defense, aided by British troops, is valiant, but nevertheless ends in a Mediterranean Dunkirk as 50,000 troops are evacuated from the Greek mainland. Many escape to the Greek island of Crete, but the island proves no refuge as the Germans pursue their enemy and fill the skies above the wine-dark sea with parachutes as German airborne assault brings savage fighting, ending in further defeat and evacuation. America slowly realizes that it cannot stand aloof from a war that is rapidly and clearly becoming not just a war like any other, but a struggle for freedom, for values central to the American way of life. The American Congress brings Lend-Lease into law. The United States will now supply Britain with whatever is needed to ensure the survival of freedom in Europe. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel has begun to earn a place in history. His inspired generalship results in the reversal of British advances. Rommel even captures his opposite number as a prisoner of war. The German High Command think Rommel has gone mad. Germany has its attention elsewhere as the greatest military operation in world history rolls forward. This is Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In the Nazis' fictional mythology and theory of history, an insane worldview of past, present, and future combined, the destruction of the Soviet system is Armageddon, the final battle, the struggle of good and evil, a fight that will effectively end history. The Soviet forces, though large, were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. Armies can only reflect the strengths and weaknesses of the society from which they're drawn. The Soviet command had been savagely targeted by Stalin's purges. A climate of fear pervaded the Russian army. Fear to show initiative, fear to show independence of thought. The initial successes of Barbarossa had led Hitler to already plan triumphal victory celebrations, with armies marching through the streets of Moscow in a commemoration of the ultimate victory of Nazism. In that late summer of 1941, the future of world civilization stood poised in the balance. The fighting that was in the coming months to take place in Russia, in the desert and on the oceans, that would take place on as yet unimagined battlefields, would begin the long march to defeat for the forces of darkness. The summer countryside of Russia was ideal for armored warfare, a war of vast spaces, limitless horizons, with no natural obstacle to aid a defender. Operation Barbarossa had consisted of three great thrusts, massive armored attacks into the expanse of the Russian heartland. In the first month of Barbarossa, hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war were taken by the Nazis as the three-pronged attack began. In the north of Russia, the main thrust of advance came around the city of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. The capital of Tsarist Russia, Leningrad was a city of 2.5 million and was ordered by Stalin to resist to the end, to never surrender. The Germans surrounded Leningrad with a tight, strangling ligature of siege. The necessity of war can make desperate alliances possible. In 1939, the Soviet Union had cynically used its size to bully and invade its neighbor Finland. When Germany had attacked the USSR, the Finns knew that in alliance with Germany lay their only chance to avenge that defeat and regain their lost lands. In the very far north, Finnish armies added a fourth dimension to Barbarossa, attacking towards Leningrad and completing the Axis grip encircling the city. The Soviet Union realized that Barbarossa was not a war that would be resolved with some minor reduction of borders, not a war that could be negotiated or compromised into peace. For both communism and Nazism, Barbarossa was a fight of mutual destruction. In the end, only one system would, or indeed could, remain. Stalin called on the Soviet people to fight what he called a great patriotic war. Stalin ruthlessly ordered a policy of scorched earth. Before the advancing Germans, the retreating Russians were to demolish the very fabric of the country, destroying buildings, burning crops, cities, and towns. Destroying or taking away anything that would be of the remotest value to the invader. Whole factories and industries which were necessary to the Russian war effort were dismantled piece by piece and moved across the immense distance of the Soviet Union to the east of Moscow, from Europe into Asia, beyond the Ural Mountains to the depths of Siberia. In the vast swirling maelstrom that was Barbarossa, where lines of advance vaulted across the maps of generals, where units lay at the end of tenuous and distant lines of supply, there were spaces around and behind the Germans. Into these spaces, the partisan armies of Russia formed. Usually led by fanatical communists, these forces conducted a campaign of sabotage, ambush, and assassination, what later would be called guerrilla war. Stalin was prepared to dismantle the mental landscape of the communist state and the Bolshevik Revolution. The atheism of communism was abandoned, and the church encouraged to present the war as a holy war, a fight for the God of the Russians. Once the damaging influence of communism upon the Soviet war machine was abandoned, old Tsarist military traditions were revived. Traditions that built martial spirit and esprit de corps. In the south of Russia, the German advance pushed on, deep into the black soil region of the Ukraine. This was an attack upon both the agricultural wealth and the southern industrial cities of the Soviet Union, towards cities such as Stalingrad. After just 1 month of fighting in the east, the Germans were already planning a triumphal victory procession through the streets of Moscow to take place in late August. Hitler had stated that Germany's aim in the east should be firstly to rule, secondly to administer, thirdly to exploit. Hitler believed his enemies beneath contempt as both communists and as Slavic peoples. Hitler abandoned the rules and conventions of war for Barbarossa. The German army was given orders to shoot dead anyone in the east who opposed them. Moscow and Leningrad were to be systematically razed, wiped from the map, the inhabitants annihilated or driven out by starvation. The Germans were to institute a giant program of what would in later years come to be called ethnic cleansing. The Nazi General Plan East envisaged vast movements of population, with German peoples moving into territories freed by the removal of the existing inhabitants. In the wake of the advancing German armies came the first of the Einsatzgruppen, special squads of the SS dedicated to the calculated, methodical elimination of Jews. As it became clear that Barbarossa was a total war, a war in which German victory would bring total destruction of not just communism, but the Russian people, the Red Army stiffened its resolve and will to resist, reorganized, and became more competent in resisting German attacks. The industrial base that the Soviet Union had managed to move to the east enabled the material losses of the first few months to be replaced. The German attacks may have been on a scale never before seen, but in fact the cold, hard light of hindsight shows that the Germans had not in fact prepared enough. Their reserves of supplies and fresh troops were not enough to exploit the massive successes and advances. Massive spaces created behind the armies still left room for Soviet partisans to sabotage and disrupt the German supply lines. As the year progressed, as September passed to October, rains which turned roads to mud further hampered and slowed the Nazi advance. In spite of this increasing resistance, Hitler still chose to gamble with the thin and shallow reserves of German strength. He ordered that the war should be brought to an end in 1941. In October, he ordered that the final attack should be made upon the Soviet capital, Moscow, a thrust straight to the heart of Soviet power. In the western desert of North Africa, battles were fought between the Afrika Korps and the British Army. The Germans under Rommel had pushed the British back and laid siege to the port of Tobruk.
The battle for Tobruk was an essential one for Rommel to win. The German plan was to push forward, to attack and take Egypt and the Suez Canal.
From that base to threaten British Middle Eastern oil, and perhaps even to push into British India. Tobruk was literally a thorn in Rommel's side, enabling the British to strike at the rear of any Afrika Korps advance. Churchill thought the Western Desert a crucial theater of war. At that time, it was the only battlefield on which the British Army could directly engage the German Army. For a Britain which was having just to take it, absorb all the bombs that the Luftwaffe could drop, and endure the toll of shipping attacks in the North Atlantic, with all the attendant sacrifice and hardship, the war in the desert was the only campaign where the British did not have to wait and see what the enemy would do. Churchill bombarded the commanders of his force in the Middle East with instructions and suggestions. Commanders were given only a short time in which to prove themselves. In the spring of 1941, General Wavell had been dismissed for failure in the offensive, which had been defeated by Rommel's genius for improvisation. Churchill was persuaded by Wavell's successor, Auchinleck, to throw precious resources at the army in Egypt, now named the Eighth Army. In an offensive codenamed Crusader, the 8th Army carefully planned an attack on the Germans in November 1941. Rommel anticipated and preempted the move, mounting a renewed assault of his own upon the port of Tobruk. Rommel was an innovating, inspired general who could react quickly. He turned his attack around and smashed back the 8th Army. Time and time again, in the Desert War, both sides would be limited from exploiting their successes by problems of supply.
Rommel could not pursue the British, and once more the two armies fell back to regather their strength. The Germans returned to the siege of Tobruk. The British, under yet another new general, considered their plan of action. With German involvement in the Mediterranean, the German supply lines were becoming stronger. Soon, Rommel would be capable of a push that would place Britain's future in the war in jeopardy.
Across the Atlantic, the United States was slowly but surely being drawn onto the center stage of the action. British Prime Minister Churchill knew that the defeat of Nazi Germany would not come without the direct involvement of the United States.
We shall give every possible assistance to Britain and to all who with Britain are resisting Hitlerism or its equivalent.
All British diplomacy was directed in a campaign of persuasion and propaganda at the American government and public. Throughout the war, in a series of agreements, America was drawn closer to the war.
In August 1941, at the Placentia Bay Conference in Canada, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed and signed what came to be known as the Atlantic Charter.
The Charter was an agreement, a statement of shared beliefs that was a list of war aims and a blueprint for the post-war peace. Neither Britain nor America sought conquest of territory. No border was to change, no territory altered without consent of the population. All peoples have the right of self-government restored. After the war, all states would have the right to economic resources for prosperity. All countries were to collaborate for international prosperity. After the destruction of Nazi tyranny would be the establishment of a lasting peace. There was to be freedom of the sea. All nations were to abandon force. Despite the shared aspirations of the Atlantic Charter, America was still legally a neutral country, with many of its citizens wanting their country to stay firmly out of any foreign war. Yet the legally neutral U.S. was already fighting an unofficial war against the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, and its force of U-boats in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a naval battle in the conventional sense, some climactic struggle, an engagement where all forces met together and a war could be won in a day or in an hour. Rather, the Battle of the Atlantic has been famously described as trench warfare at sea, where each side sought to destroy the other, a fight of numbers, a fight only to kill. It was a war that was simple to understand. Sink British ships faster than British shipyards could build replacements. Build replacement U-boats faster than the British Navy could destroy their attackers. The war would be won. A simple economic equation would give a target that would be expressed in mathematics, in numbers and tons of ships that must be sent to the bottom. The autumn of 1941 was called the happy time for the German Navy. It was a time when victories seemed easy. Once France had fallen and the whole Atlantic coast of Europe stood free for Axis use, When the isolationist sentiment of the United States was strong, the simple target was to sink between 600 and 750,000 tons of British-bound shipping per month. This would bring Nazi victory in a year. The early part of the war was a time of missed opportunities, but by the autumn of 1941, the number of boats had risen and tactics devised which were to seriously threaten Atlantic trade.
In 1941, for all submarines, for all ships, to find an enemy at sea in the vast expanse of the ocean was a difficult task.
Radars were primitive, not yet perfected for use at sea. Sonar was a short-range weapon, only useful for a surface ship attacking a close underwater target. A U-boat finding a target was dependent on visual sightings, limited to the distance of the horizon. From the low angle of a submarine tower, the U-boat officer was worse off than the lookout of a sailing ship atop a tall mast.
The convoy system that grouped merchant vessels together under the protection of warships was an old tactic that dated from the days of sailing navies. It had defeated the U-boat in World War I. It not only meant that the attacker would have to fight warships, the convoy system meant that targets were harder to find. A convoy of 30 ships closely grouped together was harder to find than 30 individual ships strung out across the shipping lanes of the ocean. The United States Navy escorted convoys halfway, effectively doubling the number of ships available to deter the enemy. The Kriegsmarine of World War II had new tactics, the doctrine of the wolf pack. The bold U-boat commander was not intimidated by the convoy, and when attacking in a wolf pack could still inflict heavy losses. With large numbers of U-boats, the submarines could be spread in a line across the possible course of a convoy of merchantmen. When a sighting was made, high-frequency radio messages would transmit the convoy's position to a shore base. That would in turn broadcast a guidance signal that would lead all submarines to attack the target. It was as if a giant drift net was laid across the ocean. A U-boat making first contact would silently, discreetly shadow the merchant ships, sending the signals to gather the other members of the wolf pack. The attack would be made at night. The commanders of U-boats needed courage to stealthily approach the convoy in the darkness, trying to pass through the screen of escorts, closing to perhaps within 600 meters before firing. For the merchant seamen, the Battle of the Atlantic was a slow and tense torture. The days spent scanning the sea for the periscope trail that might reveal an unseen enemy. At night, waiting for almost inevitable explosions, each ship dying a particular death. Oil tankers would explode in white pillars of flame. Cargoes of heavy iron machinery would drag ship and crew to the depths in minutes. In the morning, a convoy would trail a wake of the debris, burning oil, bodies, stranded sailors awaiting rescue, destroyed ships. Against the submarine on the surface at night, there was little that an escort of warships could do. On the surface, most U-boats were fast enough to get away from a pursuer. Sonar, the underwater radar, in its infancy could not find a surfaced U-boat. The U-boat commander needed courage and luck, but fortune favored the bold, who could make rich pickings. The balance of tactical strength lay with the Germans. Even though convoyed ships were more secure than lone sailings, the convoys were not enough defense.
the ideas and weaponry not sufficiently evolved to present any real threat. In 1941, 3.6 million tons of shipping was sunk, an average of 250,000 tons per month. The North Atlantic was a hard, unforgiving environment with savage weather and bitter storms, water in which men survived for minutes, tempests which battered and exhausted men on both sides, men in a state of constant alert. The submarine hull, designed for underwater, made a rolling, unstable platform on the surface. U-boat officers did not look out across the sea, rather they looked up from the surface. Long hours were spent drenched by freezing, smashing waves.
The danger lay when escorts found a U-boat on the surface or locked on with sonar. In a surface duel of gunfire, the U-boat would lose. If submerged and targeted by sonar, the U-boat crew had to endure the terror of depth charging, when crews would stand in complete silence, listening to the sonar beam pinging their hull, hearing the swish of propellers. The very skin of sailors and the hull of the boat as one, the slightest knock to either causing a paroxysm of fear. The explosions would convulse the boats, causing instruments to shatter, electrics to fail, and seals explode with leaks of air and seawater. Attacks could last for a day. In the mythology of World War II, the submarine, the U-boat, the Untersee boat, is associated with the Nazis. Yet, in fact, they were slow to realize the value of this arm of their navy. The submarine was not popular with sailors in any navy. Admirals brought up on surface action were reluctant to appreciate the strength of underwater forces. Fiction and drama, the mythology of World War II, have given us a false impression, a fabled account of how submarine operations were fought. The submarine of World War II is better described as a torpedo boat with the ability to hide underwater. The submarine, as a capital warship, able to operate independently, submerged for many months, with as high a speed as surface ships, with as high a speed above as below the surface, able to operate at extreme depths, with weapons capable of striking from extreme ranges, was, in 1941, a weapon of the future. Although the U-boats were enjoying successes, they had their great weaknesses, which were to be exploited. The World War II U-boat came to the surface to attack, was slow when underwater, could only travel submerged for a short time, and was forced to regularly surface to recharge batteries. When surfaced, its light armament made it an easy target. When a wolf pack was summoned to gather around a convoy, their voyages into position had to be made at high speed on the surface. Otherwise, a convoy could not be caught. A major weakness of the U-boat, which would be exploited, was its vulnerability to air attack. The British and the Americans realized the value of air protection for convoys. In 1941, the British occupied Iceland to extend the range of air patrols to the mid-Atlantic. Special radars were developed, which could be mounted on aircraft, which, coupled to powerful searchlights, meant that the submarine was not safe on the surface at night. The use of air power made the coordination of wolfpack attacks far more difficult. The U-boat's frequent periods on the surface became a hell of tension, times of constant restless alerts, with sudden attack, panics, and emergency dives. A key weapon in the Battle of the Atlantic was the breaking of German codes.
Time and time again in the history of war, this most secret part of Britain's armory would play a crucial role. It was in the Battle of the Atlantic that the first breakthrough in the Codebreakers' War was made. British sailors had courageously boarded sinking U-boats, fought with the crews, and captured signals equipment and codebooks, materials that had given the first clues in the secret war. By reading the messages sent to the U-boat packs, convoys could be rerouted and aircraft dispatched to attack. Many brave men were to lose their lives in the Atlantic in 1941. Merchant seamen left adrift as the convoy could not stop to rescue survivors. The crews of U-boats had the highest rate of loss of any serving in the war. The greatest defense that the British had against the U-boat assault was simply to reverse the weakness, to reverse the vulnerability. Factored into the grim mathematics of the campaign was Britain's pre-war need to import more than 50 million tons of goods each year, from the rare and exotic materials of war to the everyday staple foods of life. By 1941, the British people had cut this figure by more than half to only 23 million tons. For ordinary people, this meant a strict and severe regime of food rationing, with many favorite foods disappearing altogether. The British people became a nation of small peasant farmers. Livestock were to be found in the backyards of cities and towns. Every tiny scrap of land was turned into a vegetable patch. The agricultural industry began to exploit and wring every gram of produce from the most marginal areas of land. New areas came under the plow. The powers of the state to conscript and direct labor created a land army where workers were directed to work on the farms. The image of grim queues of shortage and the persistent folk memory of the hardships of rationing disguise a historic scientific fact that the population of Britain was, in fact, never so properly fed with the correct dietary balance. The rationing extended to almost every area of life. Private motoring practically disappeared as it became impossible to fuel a car. Some automobiles were converted to gas, with a ballooning comedy gas bag swaying atop the roof. Fashions changed to reflect wartime shortages of fabric. If Britain was turned into a nation of small farmers, it was also turned into a nation of petty criminals. The strictness of state control led inevitably to a black market. When state regulations seemed so absolute and far-reaching, the pressure amongst even the most law-abiding to obtain the smallest luxuries by whatever means possible, with no questions asked, was irresistible. The British people were told time and time again what to do and how to do it, in a barrage of propaganda and public information that permeated every aspect of daily life. In a war for freedom, British subjects became controlled, less free than ever before. Another factor in the algebra of the submarine war was the rate at which ships could replace those sunk. Once again, war provided the stimulus for innovation, and the shipbuilding industry responded by changing design and construction to build more ships more quickly. The product of this innovation came to be known as the Liberty ship. These were mass-produced ships, built by methods more akin to the auto assembly line. The design was British, but modified into practicality by American builders. More than 2,500 were built, sometimes in phenomenally short periods. On one occasion, as short a period as 4 days and 15 hours from laying of keel to launch. The cost and time-saving methods of construction and the use of workers unused to shipbuilding meant that the quality of the ships was sometimes doubtful. Some could just fall apart. But in their vast numbers, they piled the odds against the Axis. In November 1941, the German army was ordered to win the war. to finish off the Russians by capturing the Russian capital, Moscow. This was a gamble. The original planners of Barbarossa had not expected such success to come so soon. The capture of Moscow needed the last desperate effort by German soldiers who had already expended so much. What Hitler was to call the final effort of willpower was a push by troops at the very end of their energy.
By the end of November, amidst the snows and mud of the Russian winter, the German armies were within 30 kilometers of Moscow. The city had been evacuated and the Kremlin prepared for demolition, as a preferred fate for the historical heart of Russia.
Early in December, the Germans had to end the attack. Exhausted, they hoped for a pause before renewed fighting in the spring. Instead, on December 5th, the Soviet army launched a ferocious counterattack. The German army, unequipped to fight in winter, suffered terrible losses in the deepest cold.
The weakness rather than the strength of a dictatorship was revealed. The weakness of a leadership where war was directed by a single will and a single ego.
Hitler refused to give ground, refused to order retreat that could save his forward units from encirclement and defeat. In the end, the Germans suffered heavy casualties and were pushed back 300 kilometers from Moscow. Barbarossa ended in the snow before Moscow. There was still much fighting and dying to be done. But the greatest and most telling death in Barbarossa was the myth of German invincibility. An army used to carrying all before it had been defeated. 980,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly a third of those who started the invasion had been lost. The Russian soldiers who so stunned the Germans with surprise attacks were fresh from Russia's Far East, a reflection of the truth that the war was a global war. Russia had been able to move these troops across Asia because there was no longer a threat from the Empire of Japan, whose gaze looked another way. It was decisions made on the other side of the globe that enabled the Soviet leadership to deploy the Siberian forces against the Nazi armies. Decisions made in Tokyo, capital of the Empire of Japan. Japan was allied to the fascists of Germany and Italy, but it would be a mistake to say that the three major members of the Axis shared a dominant ideology. Japan shared a theory of racial superiority, shared a militarism which saw armed force as a virtue. However, the prime Japanese policy aim was to supplant the European powers as the dominant political and economic forces in Asia. Had Germany been the dominant power in the Pacific rather than Britain and America, the relationships of alliance would have been reversed. Japan had long harbored ambitions against Soviet territory in the Far East. Japan looked everywhere in the Far East with envious eyes upon the resources of neighboring states, looking to expand to the north through its puppet state of Manchuria, and to the south and east into the Pacific. By late 1941, Japan's envy and ambition was directed only to the south. Japan, in 1941, had been at war for longer than any other of the major powers, fighting a war of conquest in China. Japan's motivation in this expansion was resources. In a circular logic, it fought wars to provide the materials to power its armed forces to fight more wars. Oil, aluminum, tin, rubber were all materials which Japan could not produce. Japan was dependent on imports of food to feed its population. The richest areas of Southeast Asia, the vast rubber plantations of British Malaya, the oil of Indonesia, the vast rice fields of French Vietnam, were all controlled by Europeans. Japan was a militaristic state, dominated by the needs of the armed forces. The Emperor Hirohito believed a god by the Japanese people reigned but did not actually rule. Power lay with a government dominated by generals. When, in July, Japan took advantage of the fall of France to seize the French colony of Indochina, the United States broke all relations with the empire. Japan invited Indochina to be a member of the Greater Co-Prosperity Sphere, an organization whose words spoke of independence for the indigenous peoples of Asia, but in action was just a mechanism for draining the resources of the member states, redirecting them with ever greater ruthlessness towards Japan. The United States demanded that before trade could be restored, Japan must both withdraw from Indochina and from the long war against China herself. America was preparing for war, recalling early in the year the preeminent soldier Douglas MacArthur to command in the Pacific. Characteristically, MacArthur had taken a positive stance with a plan to defend the Philippines with strong and modern forces. To the Japanese, this American policy only reinforced a paranoid sense of persecution, reinforcing those who argued war was essential. When, in October 1941, Hideki Tojo, an aggressive general, became prime minister, the path for Japan was set to war, and secret preparations were begun. The Japanese knew that to fight a war of expansion in the Pacific, they had to neutralize the American Navy in the Pacific. The American Navy was then the largest in the world. While negotiating peace, the base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was targeted for surprise assault. The Japanese fleet approached in complete secrecy, hiding behind a weather front as it crossed the ocean. The fleet of aircraft carriers came by a distant, indirect route, circling far around the north of Hawaii from this least likely direction of attack.
On December 11, 1941, at 6 a.m., the Japanese planes appeared in the skies of Hawaii. It was a Sunday morning. Surprise was complete. At Pearl Harbor that day, 70 warships lay at anchor, including 8 battleships. Torpedo and dive bombers attacked the lines of ships and the airfields. Then high-level bombers made further assaults. In an attack that lasted a bare 2 hours, 6 battleships were sunk and 2 damaged. Numerous smaller ships also sunk and damaged. More than 160 aircraft were destroyed. 2,403 servicemen and civilians were killed, and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese losses were a mere 29 aircraft. In a moment of caution, the Japanese, fearing a counterattack, failed to complete the action with a series of attacks upon the harbor's dockyard, the repair and refueling facilities. Mundane, unglamorous targets, which have as great a significance as any capital warship. Significantly, as dramatic as the burning battleships appeared, the battleship was the naval weapon of the past. Japan had used aircraft carriers to attack its enemy, but had failed to find and destroy U.S. aircraft carriers that had been at sea that day on exercise. To say that the attack found the Americans completely unprepared and totally and completely ignorant of a Japanese threat is wrong. America was expecting Japanese attacks, but it was thought this first strike would be against the American forces in the Philippines, rather than at Pearl Harbor. If the attack were made on Hawaii, it would be directed from the nearest Japanese territory to the southwest of the islands. Pearl Harbor was on full alert to protect against sabotage. U.S. planes were grouped together to guard against attack by saboteur, a move which made it easy for Japanese planes to make their attacks. Hawaii was protected by radar. The attacking waves of Japanese aircraft were detected. The surprise lay in that America was not looking for the attack. As tactics, as a demonstration of the use of stealth and concealment using the tools of war, Pearl Harbor is a textbook example of stunning victory.
As strategy, though, the Japanese action was a catastrophic move, a move which caused the ruin of every scheme, device, and stratagem of their country. The attack on that Sunday morning condemned the Japanese forces to eventual destruction. The Japanese were attempting a victory to match that of Trafalgar, a defeat that meant the American Navy would be swept from the sea to allow the Japanese to strike where they wished at will. Once stirred, the strengths of America, the ability for organization, for efficiency, the positive optimism and self-belief, the sheer volume of wealth and industry made America a terrible foe. Pearl Harbor was an event that, at a stroke, galvanized the American nation, resolving all difference, quelling all isolationist sentiment.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The Japanese planned to take advantage of the defeat by initiating a massive plan of invasion and conquest across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Their strength would be increased as a result and deter the USA from attacking the empire. The reasoning, the wishful thinking of the Japanese planners, was that the US would accept the new state of affairs, accept Japan as the new dominant power, and compromise a peace. The harder-headed within the Japanese armed forces knew in their hearts and minds that Pearl Harbor was not a war-winning victory, simply a triumph that had bought time in which to gamble, that through a desperate effort, the US could be defeated. Privately, though, secretly, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, predicted, "I can run wild for the first 6 months or a year. I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years." Anyone who has seen the oil fields of Texas and the factories of Detroit knows this. 6 months, by the end of which victory must be won or defeat was inevitable. Victory would be impossible in a long war. That very lack of the raw materials and industrial strength that motivated their ambitions would be their downfall in a contest with the titanic power of America. On December 7th, Germany and Italy declared war on America. Winston Churchill said he slept easily for the first time in the war. With the attack upon the U.S. fleet, battles encircled the globe. To the people of America, this was the beginning of the war. For the forces of fascism, the beginning of the end. Next time on World War II, The Complete History. The Japanese war effort rolls out across the Pacific. In the precious months bought by the attack on Pearl Harbor, country after country are swamped by a tidal wave of Japanese might. Thousands of troops surrender as Singapore falls in the greatest defeat the British Empire has ever known. The defeat, a catastrophe, a textbook example of military disaster. Douglas MacArthur promises to return as U.S. forces are driven from the Philippines with the capture of thousands of U.S. soldiers. In the seas off Malaya, air forces once again prove the deadly enemy of the mighty battleship as 2 British warships are sunk. In Russia, the German forces endure the severest of winters and thousands of poorly equipped soldiers die of cold. In the spring, the German offensive is renewed with attacks into the south towards the industrial heart of southern Russia, towards Stalingrad. In the north, Leningrad endures its siege. Russian strength grows, and convoys of supplies fight their way through Arctic seas, bringing the materials of war from the UK and the USA. In Europe, the fighting in the Mediterranean and North Africa reaches new levels with the intensification of the Siege of Malta and the Africa Corps under Rommel mounting ever more threatening operations in the desert. In the skies of Britain and Germany, the war becomes an open conflict of civilizations as each side targets air raids at centers of culture and history. The enemies of the Axis come together to issue the United Nations Declaration. After a few months of conquest and triumph, the worst predictions of saner Japanese minds begin to come true. American bombers appear in the skies above Tokyo. In two titanic naval battles in the Pacific, the tide begins to turn against Japan. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, a stalemate. At the Battle of Midway, American carrier aircraft tear the heart from the Japanese Imperial Navy. And the long, slow endgame of Japan's defeat is already begun.